Ethan Edwards draws from more than 30 years of industry experience as an e-learning instructional designer and developer. He's responsible for the delivery of the internal and external training and communications that reflect Allen Interaction's unique perspective on creating meaningful, memorable, and motivational learning solutions backed by the best instructional design and latest technologies. Ellen Burns Johnson has crafted the instructional strategy and design for dozens of initiatives, including such diverse topics as hospitality software, elder abuse prevention, corporate compliance, early childhood classroom safety, and medical adhesives. Her clients have included nonprofits, government agencies, and multiple Fortune 500 companies. A highly collaborative person, Ellen delights in bringing people together to tackle big learning challenges. Her e-learning courses have won multiple awards for interactivity and gameful design. We are so pleased to have both of you with us. Ethan and Ellen, please take it away.
Thanks, David. Got to live up to that introduction now, Ethan.
That's right.
Are you ready?
Yeah, so we're going to just start with a big question that's on all of our minds. Now what? You know, the world sort of changed for a lot of people a couple months ago when such drastic changes in the way people get together and meet and work got shut down. And so we all, like this raccoon here, sort of got drenched all of a sudden. And if you know anything about raccoons, they're very private and secretive and would probably rather just go hide than to deal with the problem. And so we may be feeling like that, but unfortunately it is not a possibility for most of us. And so we have to figure out, well, how are we going to, for many people, are suddenly forced to do something that maybe we've been considering for a long time, thinking, you know, our organization should become more distance learning oriented, or we should have our training online. But, you know, putting your toe in and testing things slowly, and suddenly that no longer is an option. And so people are being, you know, given the test of the deep water to see, well, what are we doing? And so what we want to do in this seminar is just, you know, talk about what are the options and what are some of the pitfalls and opportunities, and have a chance for you to interact about how to best go about this. So that's the big idea here.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we wanted to start with, I think David has a poll lined up for us really quick. We just want to know how it's been going. You know, I'm assuming everyone is here because they're having, you know, you're thinking about the questions and the topics that Ethan just described. We want to know how it's been going for you over the last few months. If you've been familiar with digital delivery of training and learning in the past and you've had to change your methods for some reason, how has that been going? If you are moving from ILT to digital delivery, how has that been going? And that's kind of the driver of our poll question really here. It sounds like it's been going pretty average for most people, and good, I think, is their second highest response. Fortunately, no one has responded very poor yet, so I'm really glad to hear that. But a pretty small number of people have been finding it to be an excellent transition. Yeah. So I think, go ahead, Ethan.
Well, I think it's interesting to see this result because it sort of mirrors, I think, what we found in general in switching our work this way too. I think a lot of people feared that it was going to be really bad, and it turned out to be okay. You know, I think maybe we're not excelling in every point, but I don't think there's been as many disasters as when I talked to people right away when they had no idea how they were going to survive. So I think the transition, it appears, has been going at least normal.
Yeah, it kind of does remind me of, you know, the adage that we repeat sometimes as we're designing learning interactions is if you have a motivated learner, they will find the information that they need. You won't be able to stop them. They will go out and they will get it. It's kind of the same thing with people working in any way. I mean, if you have a motivated employee, if you have a motivated person, they will find a way to make it happen. Come hell, high water, or bad Zoom connections.
Let's think about what we're actually, what we're talking about. You know, we talk about distance and what we're translating into. And there's sort of three things I think are the big categories for what's open to us at this moment. We talk about webinars, we talk about VILT, and we talk about e-learning. I think oftentimes people use those terms interchangeably, and in doing so, we lose a lot of meaning and we get some confusion. How we're going to use these terms, webinars are, and of course there's a spectrum where things occur at all levels. So this is a gross simplification, but webinars generally are intended to disseminate information. That it's primarily a one-way exchange. It's a way to deliver information to a large number of people without them having to gather in one place. So using one facilitator who's basically presenting information. There might be limited interactions through chat and some minimal polling. I would say what we're doing here is sort of more closely aligned with a webinar, that Ellen and I are the primary actors here and delivering stuff.
Right. We'll try to make it fun, but with 57 or 55 people on the line, it makes it really difficult to do something like a VILT experience, which is supposed to be more like a classroom experience from the learners and the facilitators' perspectives. Obviously, if it's virtually mediated, it's going to be a very different experience in terms of how often you're getting around, how you might configure groups and so on and so forth. But in terms of the level of interactivity and the level of interaction between the facilitator and the participants, a virtual instructor-led training session is much more interactive than a webinar. At least that's how we think about it, right, Ethan?
Right. And just for instance, I think it was entirely appropriate for David to have asked everyone to turn off their video, just because it would be distraction. In a VILT, it would be rare for that to be your requirement, because sort of that video and immediate connection is essential for establishing the kind of real interactivity and interchange that you want in a class. Of course, everything has its costs. It's hard to do that, and there's crashes between people talking at the same time and so forth, and it falls apart when you get a bigger group. And so then finally, if you're really focused on that individual experience, then you can go all the way to what we call e-learning, which is asynchronous individualized instruction, where there's the instructor is sort of no longer active at the learning moment, that the learner is logged in and is using a programmed module that is trying to create as much engagement and individualization as possible.
One of the things we wanted to ask, I think on this slide, we had another poll lined up, only 2 polls, I think, for that session. Most of it's going to be us speaking to one another and then answering questions from the chat. But David, if you want to launch that poll number 1 to ask what types of digital delivery have you tried? So again, going with the definitions that we've presented here, we're curious if you've tried all 3 of these methods of digital delivery, or if only one is more popular than others. So let's get maybe a minute or so to put your answers into the poll. And while everyone's doing that, Ethan, we did see a question come in from Mary asking about what the best number of people is for a VILT. We get this question a lot.
We sure do, and I should have a better answer. It depends, is the answer. But it depends a lot on the platform. It depends on the nature of the content, and it frankly depends on the experience and the skills of the facilitator. Mm. But in our experience, we try to shoot for about 12 to 15. Once you get more than that, I find that it becomes harder to provide that individualized attention. It's possible, and again, it depends if you can create more activities that are self-monitored and use breakout groups in a way to your advantage. But certainly I think once you get over 25 or 30, it really becomes problematic, at least for me. You don't want them too small either, though, actually, because there's a great deal of benefit from the learners interacting with themselves rather than just only with the instructor. So I find when it gets too small, you'd think, wouldn't that be great? Well, it's sort of good for that conversation, but I find it's an overall less satisfying learning experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You don't get as much back and forth and generation of different new ideas and new connections if you only have 4 people in your VILT session.
Yeah. When you get bigger than 30, it's possible, but then I think a lot of the interactivity ends up, you're forced to do it between sessions, giving assignments and have people work and then have different ways that can check in.
Mhm.
but it's really unwieldy to have active interactivity, high level with and monitoring it all with more people than that.
Right. I mean, Zoom has a breakout room feature. I think a lot of our online meeting and online webinar tools do. So breakout sessions are a way, I think, to get around that. But like you mentioned, from a facilitation perspective, you could take 60 people and break them up into 10 different breakout rooms of 6 people. But then as a facilitator, you're not really spending a lot of quality time with each group because you've got to bounce around between 10 groups. So there is a trade-off. And yeah, it does depend, but I feel pretty comfortable with the number range that you provided, Ethan, 12 to 15, something like that. Looks like most people have had some experience with webinars, just looking at our poll results, but it seems pretty even across the board.
Yeah.
People have been trying e-learning, people have been trying VILT. We also have a good return. I think 14% of those who responded to the survey also mentioned other. So I'm curious for those folks who said other, what other means to you. And I would like to, if you type your other options in the chat so we can know what that means. That might generate some good discussion down the road.
Yeah,
So
it looks like we have a pretty experienced group here, so that's great.
yeah, that's fantastic. We'll get some great discussion. I think some good recommendations from our participants. So if you did click other in that last poll, put your other ideas in the chat. We'd like to know. For now, just kind of continuing to go with our three broad categories. One of the things we talk about, when you're trying to decide what platform or what methodology or what modality you're going to go with for a particular learning need or training need, is what's available to you. But another thing you must consider as an instructional designer or a learning experience designer is what are the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. So can we talk a little bit about that, Ethan? What is a webinar good for? What is VILT good for? What is asynchronous e-learning good for?
Sure. Yeah, I think we already got a sense of it from some of the chat. Webinars are great for distributing information. They're not so great for changing performance. And mainly it's because it's almost impossible to create practice opportunities and application opportunities in webinars. If it's highly conceptual and information-based, you can actually have some discussions, but it's more of information. The benefit of that is, I don't want to overstate this, but there's sort of minimal preparation. It's what you would prepare for a regular sort of presentation of any sort. And it has a lifetime because it can be recorded and replayed. But if you want to approach more performance-oriented training where people are going to be held accountable for increasing their skills, then you're going to have to sort of move to one of these other two. And I think sort of the biggest difference in my mind is the degree to which you are able to individualize in your VILT or how much of that is a struggle. And there are great possibilities, but it depends a lot on your facilitator availability and sort of that discipline to really be able to engage people from a distance. And so there's preparation and training that goes into there. The great thing about it is that you can change things on the fly. You can update classes really quickly. And it's good to connect learners. You can have robust discussions and exploring things together and provide coaching of sort.
Mm-hmm.
What e-learning does is really focuses, it has the potential. A lot of people use it for delivering information, which is probably not the most worthwhile use of the interactive technology. But it allows you to really focus on tasks and creating performance opportunities through simulations, through a higher level interactivity, and you can really hold people accountable for gaining skills. The downside is that it takes a while to get ready to do that. You can't say, well, let's get our e-learning and roll it out next week. It's several months of work and testing and a significant investment in time and resources as well. And once you invest in it, you don't want to do that in a topic that's going to be changing all the time, because it's actually sort of cumbersome unless you really plan in a different way how to update content and update media and so forth.
Right. So you're not saying, this is not categorically true for e-learning. You could put together an e-learning module in a day or two. It just wouldn't necessarily be using the strengths of e-learning as a learning modality, right? Because like you pointed out, the strengths of e-learning is that it's asynchronous. People can go through it until they're competent. They can practice multiple times as much as they need. And if you're putting together something that's a few slides that people click next through, that's not a great, it's not using the power of the approach.
Right, and if you have a couple days or a week to create something, you could get an outstanding VILT put together in a week, and you'd have a pretty junky e-learning put together in a week.
There were a couple, I asked folks a little bit ago to enter in what their responses to other were, and we got some really cool responses. So Drew mentioned that online discussion groups on internal social media platforms are one method. Micro-learning on mobile, which is cool to hear. I love that. As kind of a flavor of e-learning. That was from Christine. And then Susie mentioned social learning. So that could be a lot of different things, but I definitely see that connecting to what Drew mentioned. Yeah, and then John just said, to kind of echo with what we were just saying, that asynchronous e-learning is something he's promoted as kind of anytime, anywhere learning. You can do it when you have time, depending on the course. I think micro-learning, especially on mobile, is also seen as something that you can do kind of anywhere, anytime.
Right, and all those things point to a category which isn't reflected in these columns. And it's just sort of that spontaneous natural learning that happens in a network situation. And so using social media, using discussion forums, not so much in an intentional way, or it could be, but even there's constant opportunities for learning using technology and using various prompts to get people engaged. It's sort of spontaneous.
Mm-hmm. I think some of our participants have already answered this question, but just to make sure that we get a strong answer out there, what does asynchronous mean?
Well, asynchronous means it's happening not in sync with anybody else. It means I can log in whenever I want to and take my training. Mm-hmm. Whereas VILT, by definition, is synchronous because the class needs to gather together so they can interact. Mm-hmm. So individualized e-learning typically is asynchronous in that each individual signs on and works without regard to anybody else being online at the time.
Right. So like an in-person classroom experience is a synchronous experience. A virtual instructor-led training, VILT, is a synchronous experience. Everyone logs on at the same time. This webinar right now is a synchronous experience, but the recording afterwards can be consumed asynchronously. When we're thinking about these three different approaches, these three broadly different approaches, and then with some of our other items kind of sprinkled in, what are some considerations for where organizations are now, where they've kind of come over the last couple weeks or several weeks, couple months? It's been months. And where we might be headed next?
Yeah, well, I think this slide sort of summarizes the implications of the last slide. That there was an immediate need to go online because people were no longer going to be together, and so the idea of personal classes were out, and so and probably what people only had much experience with prior to that is webinars, and most people I think very easily realized webinars are not a very good substitute for an actual class. And so looking to VILT, that's instructor-led, but we talked about and e-learning as another way that people can learn without gathering in a place. But again, the real difference is the type of investment and the time and the uses that you're looking for. You're really looking for, if you had a hands-on lab course that you were teaching procedures in a manufacturing facility, that's probably harder to get going in VILT without people having access to those resources than you could simulate in e-learning. But that none of these things are set in stone. There's a great deal of creativity available in all situations to make them work. But right. But the question is, how are you coming up with performance-based activities, whether it's in e-learning or in VILT, that are going to be impactful for the learner? Yeah, considerations, not rules. So let's talk about some of those considerations when it comes to VILT specifically. Since it's probably not going anywhere, what are some of the considerations we should take if we are moving
from instructor-led training to VILT, or planning to expand our VILT offerings?
Well, one of the things, and it may seem too basic, but I think it's a really, really critical thing that people overlook, is thinking about your teaching space. That it matters. You know, just the same way you worry about a classroom, you set things up in a particular way, you want to set up your teaching space both to make your teaching easy and comfortable, but to present a really good view of you and your world to your learners. I know we were talking about that, Ellen. Maybe what are some of the things that you found that are so critical for getting ready to teach VILT?
Putting my dogs away.
That's right.
I had a meeting earlier. It wasn't a VILT session. I was facilitating some feedback and planning conversations with a client, and behind this this screen I got off of Craigslist, because the Zoom virtual backgrounds won't work on my machine. I have a chair, and in that chair was a dog, and I was conducting the meeting and I was very focused, and all of a sudden the dog just picked up her head and her ears turned towards the screen, and I realized I hadn't quite blocked out that part of the room. It was very distracting for me. No one mentioned anything, but it was distracting for me as the facilitator of the meeting. So for me, it's reducing distractions, not necessarily even for my audience, but for me.
Yeah, but you know, there's a lot of comments going on about different distractions. And I do want to point out that your goal shouldn't be to create this hermetically sealed alternative world. Because what makes teaching work so well is when your teacher is authentic and connecting to you more than just through the content, but also through personal experiences and connections. And so, you know, I don't keep my cat out of there. They're hiding somewhere, but they sometimes visit, and they come and say hi, and then they go away, and that brings reality and warmth and humanity. And I think that's really important to have as part of your experience, because that is what makes communication real. Mm-hmm. And so you want to not hide yourself, but get rid of unnecessary distractions, find a good space. But we were talking earlier how useful it is to have a second monitor so that you can be really comfortable in having access to all the resources you might need. But if you're teaching a lab course, mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be from your desk. You set up some teaching space in a lab. We're so used to just seeing the head in Zoom. But, you could be demoing things in a very much more naturalistic way, the same way you do in a class. And I think too often people get blinders on all of a sudden because Zoom is supposed to be in a particular way. Mm-hmm. And so you want to continue to bring all those useful teaching methods into your VILT space as much as possible.
So kind of plan your instructor's experience.
Yeah, that it's not just about the content, and it's a lot about the learner, but it's also about the teacher. It's about how do you set up a situation where the teacher can be who they need to be as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got to be comfortable to be able to really be, at your best. So what about planning? Go ahead, Ethan.
Oh, and there also is, I guess.
I think we were headed the same direction. Yeah. So what about planning the classroom experience for your learners?
Yeah, well, there's sort of the experience, right? But sort of bridging, setting up your learning space and the classroom experiences, your own skills as a presenter. There are ways that you need to talk a little bit differently, and it has to do with the audio, it has to do with how you present yourself, but those kind of skills are important. And so making sure that you're talking with an elevated energy, that you have personable sort of characteristics, you modulate your voice. And in fact, because so often you're losing other body language ways to communicate, it almost all has to be embodied in your facial expression and your voice. And it sounds silly, but those things are really essential for making sure that you are opening the door for engagement with your learners. Mm-hmm. And so you want to create that virtual classroom experience to again be personal and to connect your real self.
You mentioned modulating your voice, and that kind of connected something for me. When I am facilitating in a classroom, in a physical space, I find myself moving around a lot. I can't help myself. As people who have me on video can see, I'm using my hands to talk a lot. And when I'm in a physical space, I usually am moving around the room in that a lot, not necessarily pacing, because that would be distracting, but I move closer to someone who's asked a question, or I'll move to the back of the room just to make sure the focus of the space shifts a little bit and people are staying engaged just by looking. I'll ask people to get up often and move around. And when we're all sitting in the same desk all day, that doesn't really happen. But one thing that happens naturally when you're moving around a classroom is your voice changes because you're physically changing your body position. And so it takes a little bit of deliberate thought to start adapting that kind of voice modulation to create a similar experience on a in a VILT.
Just take some mindfulness of things that we don't typically take for granted.
Mm-hmm. Suzanne mentioned, what are our thoughts about standing during part of your presentation, or if you're facilitating a VILT session and you're the instructor, can you stand up for a bit, adjust your camera, and just keep going?
Sure, I don't see any reason not, and it's actually even okay to change your location. It actually there's a singer who's doing a series of concerts, and she moves from her different rooms in her house. And she's doing it. It's sort of pointless, but she has a reason for doing it. So I wouldn't do it randomly, but if you can do it in a pattern and justify and temper your presentation to be suited for the way you are presenting yourself, there's no reason not to do that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too. I saw something really interesting. This actually came in from the previous, I think that one of our previous slides, but Peter said checking your audio and video connections has to work really well. And I think that one related idea is one you and I have talked about a lot, Ethan, and that's having an assistant. So that can be someone from the class, a participant who you selected. If you're really lucky, you might have a secondary another colleague who can help facilitate. And you and I have worked on that, worked with that kind of setup pretty often in the courses you teach for the Allen Academy. You'll start the session and you're facilitating it as the instructor, and then I'll work behind the scenes in the chat, kind of like David is doing right now, making sure people don't have any technical issues. If they do, then we can get them resolved on the side so that the facilitator doesn't also have to be their own IT support or AV support.
Right. And to build on that, two things. Peter was just mentioning how important it is to pass control, which is something that often is forgotten, is that the teacher doesn't have to be in control of the class all the time. Reciprocal teaching is a really great skill that you can ask somebody to create a presentation, and they teach in the VILT for a while or share what they found out. It gives the teacher a little bit of a rest, but it also is a vitally important way to give responsibility and growth opportunities for the learners. And it's easy for people to zone out, but I've found that they really like being given responsibility and to be able to participate more than just as an observer. And so that sort of leads to what are their virtual classroom experiences? Just make sure that the interactions are really engaging and more than just rote responses. They don't, that we've talked about the breakout groups. Breakout groups can be wonderful ways to get smaller opportunities to interact. There are also the chat that we're using really effectively here today. I think I'm so thankful that you're all so active there. But the annotation tools are another really wonderful, flexible way to get people to collaborate by drawing or marking or weighing in with stamps or different markers on screens that you set up. And that's a great way to facilitate and spur conversations. But then the other thing I just want to remind us also that there are an immense number of resources on the web that are not necessarily right in your Zoom or on your desktop, but having what I call field trips that you all go together to a simulation website or a different experience, or else you say, go and do this and we're going to gather in 5 minutes. And those shared experiences can be really amazing to create shared understanding.
We had a couple, I think a couple questions come in that were more about kind of organizing the content. So let's maybe shift over there a little bit. A couple questions that came in were, you know, what about flipping the classroom? Another one that's kind of related are, what are some best practices in making VILT engaging and interactive? You mentioned a little bit of that, some ideas for activities just a moment ago. But when it comes to kind of taking the content that you have prepared for an instructor-led classroom training and moving it to VILT, what are some considerations you should do when you're reorganizing that content or reimagining how learners might engage with it?
Well, I think it's important to make sure you're looking at it from the learner's point of view. So often the trap is to just say, here's the content, I'm going to organize it and dump it out there without regard to how does someone who doesn't know this, how are they processing it? And in a classroom, that sort of shifts organically, sometimes through conversation. It's a little harder to get there without intention in VILT. So I think really thinking about your content in terms of what are people going to do with this, and embedding those sort of assignments and those sort of activities directly into the immediate initial exposure to content. Because the application of it is what needs to be, I mean, well, that's what you have the opportunity to add. Otherwise, you could just send out prints of content. So that's part of it. Also, I think we need to take advantage of the fact that, you know, one of the impediments of a lot of instructor-led training, and it depends on your environment, but in a lot of our organizations we work with, there'll be a training course that people come to headquarters and they'll be in a hotel for a week and they'll just be in training for 7 days straight. You know, that's needed because of the mechanics of flying people around and the cost of getting an instructor and people together. But that's a terrible way to use time. To train, because it leaves almost no time for practice, no time for really looking at things in a deeper way. And so I think one essential thing, if that's the way you are currently doing your training, is really think about breaking it up into smaller pieces that are spread out over time, if that's at all possible. Because no longer is the delivery forcing that. And so having a couple-hour session and then a few days off and another couple-hour session is way better than having 4 hours in a row.
Yeah, people need that time off to think, to process, and to practice, like you said. And I think one of the interesting implications of that reorganization you just mentioned, Ethan, where you can take something that maybe traditionally, because of logistics, was 3 8-hour days where everyone was in the same location. You can potentially stretch that out a little bit more, but also that's an opportunity to reconfigure your learning experience with a few different tools. So you could move some of those sessions into VILT, but if you have workshop style activities in your classroom training, those things don't have to happen synchronously. They don't have to happen necessarily in breakout rooms in Zoom. You could take your learners and split them up on a web forum. We had some people mention that they've been using forums early, when I think when we did the polls at the beginning of the hour. You could break people out and have them coordinate with it, whatever method that you want them to. Say, use whatever method you want to coordinate with yourself, connect via email, and then go from there. But the next time we come together, I want you guys to present on this. There are ways you can start mixing and matching different tools, different platforms, and different modalities in the virtual space that can give you a lot more mileage per hour, I guess, out of your instructor time, out of the time you have together as a class. So I think, let me just quickly scroll through some of the questions that we had. I think we touched on pretty much everything. Hey, a cat. Good timing, Cat. Which cat was that, Ethan?
That was Wedge.
Wedge. That's a great cat name. A couple people commented on the field trips idea and that they liked that really quite a lot. And I was wondering if you could maybe touch on that one more time on how it relates to kind of collaborative shared experiences. I mentioned that I think the idea of a collaborative and shared experience is one that we've kind of been weaving in. The field trip idea brings it out. I think the breakout groups and maybe like assigning people to go and teach back is one way to do that. Can you connect some of those ideas for us in a way that I'm not phrasing particularly well?
Yeah, well,
do better.
You know, just because of the things that now have been recreated out of necessity of everybody generating content in their own homes, there's actually a lot more of these experiences. This is actually in the performance world, and so, but I know there are other opportunities, or you could create them yourself. I've participated in communal watching of several musical productions, and you can chat and share responses in real time about what you're experiencing together, and it's just strikingly effective. And so there's museums, and even if it's just an enrichment thing that isn't so tightly controlled your content, I think there's very great value in fostering critical thinking, and again, those shared experiences. And look for instance, there's this Museum of Computing in Milton Keynes, England, and it has a working example of every operating system that has been in existence. And if you're talking about your current ILT, your own IT system, wouldn't it be fun to say, let's just spend a little time looking at where these have come from? And you can do this really great virtual 360-degree tour of all those computers, and you could actually have a route set up already that would sort of present that background. I just think there's unlimited resources available to us on the web right there, and we don't really pull it into our VILT as I think we could.
Yeah, especially, and we talk about, like, you go to a classroom experience, one of the first things you might do is an icebreaker activity, and it feels sometimes it's harder to do online. There are games that you can probably do. It's not just about, it's not just about the content, right? One of the things you also have to forge in a virtual setting, just like you would in a physical setting, is that sense of connectedness, of group identity. And I think that those kinds of things are really good at doing that. Just to give a quick personal story, I've been trying to get my family together every couple weeks to do kind of like a virtual hang. And one of the things we've been doing is GeoGuessr. And it's a game where it basically drops you somewhere random in the world on Google Maps, like on Google Street View. And you just walk around on Street View and you have to guess where you are in the world.
Yeah, well, I was actually thinking something like that for a new employee orientation course. If you have multiple facilities, drop people into a place and let them explore to get a sense of what is our whole organization like.
Yeah.
Different things like that.
Drop people into a place on their website.
Yeah.
Where are you? Why are you here? Okay, so I think got one more question from a couple questions from Deborah and from Christy. I'm going to put Deborah's question about books and articles to the side for a second, because we are going to share some resources in a little bit. And then Christy said, when converting a 1 to 2 day ILT to a VILT multi-session series, what recommendations do you have for the ideal maximum session length, and how many sessions is acceptable or practical considering other work and meeting distractions?
Yeah,
and I like this, because an ILT, like Christy mentioned, kind of creates a bubble. Your time is now protected. You are in a different place. VILT, that bubble doesn't exist naturally.
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things you want to do is you want to try to create that bubble. Some of our clients have done things like really to elevate the time you're in training, that if you're sitting at, well, you're at home now, and so it won't be as different, but, adding I'm in training, don't disturb, that really says this is something that's important, and making sure, giving instructions at the beginning to remind people, turn off your phone, get some coffee to be comfortable, and so forth. Those things actually are a nice reminder. But in my experience, and again, this is all very different, is that I haven't seen a remarked reduction in total classroom time going from ILT to VILT. That you don't, like when you move to e-learning, you can count on reducing learning time. I haven't seen that same difference in VILT, and so you need to so that's sort of prescribed unless you look at your content and say, we're going to streamline this because some of this content isn't as relevant right now. My best experience is in the range of 1.5 hours to 2.5 hours of an individual class time. at that point, you sort of need to get a break to be away from it for a while. Even if you do a morning and an afternoon, maybe have that and have a couple hours in between. My preference is a day, at least a day in between, because then you can take advantage of how, that vital time that someone can have an assignment to do that you can't do when you're sitting in class all day. So, but the second part of your question, what's the maximum? I think it sort of is dependent on your own policies and how you set expectations about training with your employees, because we've had 8 to 10 sessions and that has been okay. I think it's good if you have a multiple curriculum to have a break in between some of those sessions, maybe go at a good pace for about 3 or 4 weeks and then have a week off and then resume. Again, this has to be balanced with how essential is it for people to get up to these skills quicker. If I can't wait 6 weeks till I complete this training, you're going to have to do it in a much more compressed way.
I think that makes sense. There are a couple questions lingering on the VILT topic. I'm going to put those to the side for now, and we'll come back to them because I know that people are going to have questions about e-learning, and I want to make sure we have a chance to touch on that. So we've got about 15, 20 minutes left in our session, and I also want to make sure we have some chances for open Q&A. So I'm going to push us to go to e-learning. We talked about the considerations for switching from ILT to VILT, but those are both synchronous experiences where you have people doing the core activities at the same time. Yes, you might have exercises you do outside of class. Yes, you might have readings that you do as pre-work before you come into a session, whether that's instructor in a classroom or virtual instructor-led training. But that core part of the experience is you're with a facilitator and you're with your fellow participants at the same time. Asynchronous e-learning is really, really different. So what are some of the considerations for when we might use it and how we set ourselves and our learners up for success when we do? The first one's a dog.
Yeah. Well, when we start with content, and I think that's one of the biggest hurdles is that we are accustomed to designing way too much content into ILTs. And in most training sessions, they're sort of encyclopedic in a way, or at least the materials are, and we rely on the instructor to be clever in knowing what to skip and what isn't relevant. But if we put all of that in the e-learning, learners don't know what to do. They don't know what's the part that's okay to skip, and so they end up sort of skipping everything. And so it's really vital to have that really sharp filter to decide we need to focus only on that content which is connected to the outcomes we're looking for. And that's hard because our SMEs, your SMEs, everybody's SMEs love content. And their value comes from how wise and how what breadth they can offer. And so when you're up against saying, yeah, but we have to give as little as possible, as little as necessary, that's a big switch in how you start analyzing content. And probably I would say that's the most important thing, and probably one of the top 3 things that kills e-learning is that it's got too much content in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really different experience than connecting with another human who's able to lead you through the content and the learning and facilitate your transitions from one part of the experience to the next and give you instructions when you don't get it. In e-learning, you're relying on the e-learning to do all that.
And how that content translates to skills. Now, I said earlier that e-learning is really great if you have performance opportunities because you can create interactions to do that. But you're also going to find yourself in situations where I'm using e-learning to deliver content for whatever reason. But then you still have to think about how can I generate some active learning opportunities to make that come alive so it's not just sitting passively reading. That's the kiss of death for e-learning. Just as it is with VILT, but it's even more critical because you don't have a person there to adjust on the fly. You really have to craft that experience that's going to be engaging.
Right. And you can't rely on peer pressure to keep people tuned in either.
Right.
That actually transitions, I think, really well to this next piece. No cats, no dogs. Here we went with cute snails. Sorry if you don't think snails are cute. That'll be a topic for a different webinar. But, you know, we talked about cutting back on content, and I think that the movement around exploring what micro-learning means and how that can be designed is really related to that. We talked to, I think a couple of participants mentioned micro-learning early on. They were in the other category, and we've kind of fallen into that. I think we've taken a micro-learning approach to designing e-learning for a while. But it certainly has kind of taken off, I think, as mobile devices have become more and more ubiquitous, because if you do have to make something that is just focused on content, whether it's a video that people just listen and watch, or if it's reading that people are just taking in and considering and processing, if you're breaking it up into very small pieces that are focused on one topic or one skill or one procedure at a time and can be consumed easily from wherever the learner is within a couple minutes, I mean, that's micro-learning, right? And it is one great approach in your arsenal for moving things to an asynchronous delivery. What thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And it just, by the way, that we'll post a link that you can download this white paper about that we created. We have some pointers about micro-learning. I think a trap of micro-learning is thinking, I just get rid of everything except the essential content. What you need to do is get rid of everything except the essential interactivity. Because just because you're not sacrificing, but you're deciding we need to have these highly focused learning events. The part that is still essential when you're doing asynchronous learning is what is the learner doing and how are they getting feedback and how are they being motivated to do that thing. And so you can perhaps dispense with some of the expository content. You can rely on links to outside sites that would provide what you would normally think I got to write into this lesson, but really fine tuning that experience so that it is razor sharp into that every instant you're in that micro learning event, you're doing something that is directly applicable to what you're going to do when you're not in that training.
Yeah. Peter brought up a really good question. Is micro-learning learning, or is it just for short bursts of performance support? And I think I did touch on that a little bit in the ebook that David linked into, but I think that the take that I'd have on it is, okay, it depends on the interactivity. You can design micro-learning that kind of does double duty because it's so short. If it's the first time you're really connecting with a skill or a content or a procedure, then you can go through that experience and look through it and tap through it and scroll and so on and so forth, whatever the interactivity calls for you to do. And you can engage with that as a learner. But if the experience is short enough, even if it's, learning content, after you've done it and you're more familiar with the skill, the procedure, or the content, and you can just refer back to it as performance support. And that's, I think, one of the beauties and one of the really great things about micro-learning as a design approach is that it's learning maybe the first time, but because it's so short, it also is perfectly fine to fit within the workflow as performance support.
The trap, though, I think too often people, that the goal of doing something short supersedes the goal of doing something effective. And so your goal is still, I need to teach, unless you're really setting out to just do performance support.
Right.
But it still needs to teach. And you can try to do that as succinctly and as focused as you can, but it still has to get there. I do this series of videos. You can check my LinkedIn page if you're interested. When I used to travel all over, and one of my favorite ones, the metaphor was, I was down in Atlanta, and the MARTA system has its terrifically long escalators. And I would like those escalators to be shorter, but they have to be long enough to get me out of the ground. And so I think we have to keep that in mind, that e-learning is so often bloated. There's no question about it. And as we switch to micro-learning, that it's motivating because it takes less time, but it can be equally unmotivating if it doesn't respond and doesn't get the job done. And so it's important to balance those.
Yeah, I think sometimes, I don't get this question as much anymore, but when it comes to micro-learning, and just to kind of wrap up that particular piece before we move on to this next one, when it comes to micro-learning, there's no time restriction. I don't really get asked that question much anymore, I think because micro-learning is a little bit more common out in the design space, but micro-learning isn't 5 minutes or less. It's not 3 minutes or less. It's the one thing at a time approach. And then you'll often find that if you're doing one thing at a time, you'll create experiences that are 3 minutes long, 5 minutes long, but it could be 15 minutes long. It depends on the thing that you're using for, that you're trying to teach.
Right. And that leads us very well into this next point about developing smart. There's an awful lot of poor models of e-learning out in the world, and they're still very accessible, and they're still facilitated by our authoring tools. When you learn to use some of the tools, your test sessions are examples of e-learning no one should ever build. They are basically PowerPoint sequences with inserted trivia questions. And that's not the way to create change. And so, we have a very specific philosophy of creating immersive instructional interactivity where there's context, that the learners are authentically challenged, that the activities are not just rote clicking A, B, C, or D, but they are forcing you to engage in gestures and actions that have significance, and that there's feedback. And when you do that and you apply your resources intelligently, you end up with interactions that are unbelievably effective.
Mm-hmm.
But it isn't a thoughtless process of just translating stuff and doing the first thing that comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a thoughtful. It's designed like any type of design.
Yeah. So there is another document that sort of talks about what good e-learning needs, and you can download that as well. It's sort of it goes into that CCAF process if it's something you haven't been familiar with.
Yeah, I think it's a good introduction to designing e-learning, and it can be, you can extrapolate this to VILT because it's all about getting the human brain to change what it's doing, right? If you take a look at the resource and you want to learn more, we do offer classes, and these are some of the upcoming classes that we're offering. I'll just leave this on screen for a little bit because I think we had a couple lingering questions. But before we get to those questions, just calling out a couple things. Ethan's teaching a couple upcoming classes. We have a Design 102 class. That's where you're actually going to be teaching people how to use articulate storyline to make some of these robust interactions. And then Design 100 is a really short class that I think is a lot of fun based on what learners have told you, right, Ethan?
Yeah, the Design 100 is a broadly based class on just sort of recalibrating what expectations for e-learning, what's possible, what should be our expectations. I'm always embarrassed a little bit to have this said, but it's said repeatedly that people take that experience and say, this has completely changed my whole life in terms of what I believe e-learning should be. So it's really a philosophical and functional approach to how we should view e-learning. The 102 class is actually another one that has become very popular in that, I've been teaching sort of this kind of interactive design for quite a long time in live classes and so forth. And the frustrating thing is people say, oh, I get this, I want to do this, but I have no idea. I don't have the ability to use, my tools are no good. Mm-hmm. Well, the truth is the tools are okay. We just haven't learned them, how to use some of these basic features in an unexpected way. And so we really try to create the possibility for people to create that kind of, use the standard tools, Storyline and Captivate, to create unexpectedly interactive interactions.
Yeah, you don't need a team of HTML5 developers to make something that's compelling, even and asynchronous.
And both of these courses are part of a longer curriculum we have, the Allen Certified Instructional Professional, where we get more into the instructional design, we get into the interactivity design, and we actually have a practicum where you can work on a project with expert coaching. So if you're interested in any of that, you can take a look at our website.
Yeah. I will do one quick call. We have a sale going on for a course that starts next week. That's by Clark Aldrich, who is an e-learning and instructional guru. He is going through how to create short simulations, so highly interactive branching sims that can be incorporated as part of your asynchronous program or in any creative way you can think of, and he'll be going through how those can be used and how they can be created starting next week. So I'll just, if you want to check that out, you can of course email us, or you can go to allenacademy.com. Now, I'm going to move my mouse again. We'll leave this up on screen, I think, just so people can grab our contact info if they have additional follow-up questions. But I know we're coming up on sort of the end of the hour. A couple questions we didn't get to were, what, in VILT, do we rely on outside work a little bit more than we would in a regular classroom ILT session? And we talked about that a little bit, but I wonder, would you consider that a best practice or really something that people should be doing?
Yeah, well, I think so. And again, I'm a broken record on it depends. But for most content and most classes, they can only be improved by having more practice opportunities for learners. And oftentimes in the classroom where you don't have those breaks between sessions, you're hard pressed to get practice. And even if you do like role playing in a classroom, two people are doing it and the rest are sitting in the back sort of, dozing off. And so you don't have that opportunity that people have time to really apply it. And so I think it's really great if you can come up with really good outside assignments. They don't even have to be that extensive, but I know that it makes people feel good to turn in things and to get some feedback on their input or to use what they've done as sort of the focus of the discussion in the next session. I think those are all really great ways to make sure that people are learning more and that they're involved more.
Yeah, it is. I think it's really powerful, even if it's not a long activity. If it's something that just takes 15 minutes, some of the exercises that I've gone through as part of the ACIP program were just short things that I could doodle out in 10 to 15 minutes, but it got me thinking and applying the things I was exploring in the VILT session outside of that context and actually within the context of my normal working environment, which is exactly what you need to transfer.
And without that prompt, it's going to be the rare student that's going to do that on their own, even though we know that we're supposed to apply what we learned. But there's so many other things. And so having those expectations just gives that opportunity to make sure people have a chance to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Learners, one of the things we have in the CCAF framework is challenge. There needs to be a meaningful prompts to act, and that assignment can serve as that. Plus, especially with reading, no one wants to sit in class and read. That's not something, that's not, I think, something adult learners are interested in doing. So do you have off the top of your head any resources, books, or additional webinars that we might maybe have done and recorded in the past on transitioning to VILT from ILT? We talked a lot about that in this session, but if someone wanted to go further into that specific need, where might they go?
Well, I'm a bad source because the books I've read, and I haven't read one, a really very, very recent one, but a lot of the advice I found too formulaic to be really very helpful to create dynamic classes. All their issues are fine, that you need to have activities every few minutes and you need to, the mechanics of it. All that's right, but all of those things are not sufficient, I think, to make it great. I find just doing a Google search and looking through resources that you find online, that's what I've been doing lately. And I can't point to them right now, but they change all the time. But there's really good perspectives, blogs and things that you can come across that help spark a new idea of how you might do it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, is that the platforms that we use to conduct VILTs are software as a service platforms, right? And so they're constantly getting updated. They're constantly getting upgraded. The roadmaps have changes for 6 to 12 months out. And so a book that you get is going to be outdated as soon as you receive it. I think that's really good advice, Ethan, is just honestly go out and search for it. Check with your chapter members, see what other people are doing right now with the tools that exist right now as they exist right now.
Yeah, and related to that is make sure you have explored fully the capability of your platform. Depending on what you're in, there's, like, I hadn't fully used the annotation stuff as on Zoom before a couple months ago, and I just hadn't explored it. And when you really get into it and realize how it works, it's amazing how much it opens up possibilities.
Yeah.
And so you just need to make sure that you understand all the things that are capable of you, and not pine for what isn't there, but just make the best use of whatever it is that you have.
And one piece of advice I think that we've given a couple people is test drive a new feature in your platform every few sessions, even if you aren't planning on using it or you don't know how it might be used with your material. Just make an exercise of it with your class, saying, okay, we're going to do a little exploration with Zoom, and put together something silly to just for people to explore that that feature within the platform from a learner's perspective, but also from a facilitation perspective, because then if you've done that exploration together, you've all practiced using it. If the occasion arises where that would be the perfect fit, you've already trained everybody on how to use it. And it's a lot easier to just work it into the flow of your VILT session.
Right, that's a great suggestion.
Well, if you have additional questions, our emails and my Twitter are up on the screen. Feel free to reach out to us. With that, I think I'll turn it back over to David to wrap things out.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you so much, Ethan, and everyone who joined us. We really are grateful to have you here, and all of your contributions in the chat and your questions, I think, really made for an impactful webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.